Welcome back to the Think, See, Listen YouTube channel, where I give it to you raw and uncut and uncensored, unedited, and completely unprofessional. All to give glory to the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Chapter 5, The Great Reset, War for the World, by the great Alex Jones. He's a hero. Gonna jump right into it. Chapter 5, Yuval Noah Harari, RoboCop for the Empire. There can be little doubt that Klaus Schwab loves to quote Israeli academic and writer Yuval Noah Harari. Dr. Patrick Wood told me I should consider Harari the brain of Klaus Schwab, and many claim he is Schwab's top advisor. Harari is best known for his million-copy bestsellers, which seem to find great favor with the most powerful people in the world. The front of the paperback version of his book, Sapiens, has an endorsement from Bill Gates that reads, "I would recommend Sapiens to anyone who's interested in the history and future of our species." Gates also helpfully provided an endorsement for 21 lessons for the 21st century, writing, "Offers a helpful framework for processing the news and thinking about challenges we face." This is how Harari is described in his page. This is how Harari is described on his page for Klaus Schwab's World Economic Forum. Historian, philosopher, and the author of the bestsellers Sapiens, A Brief History of Humanity, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. Co-founder of Sapienship, a multidisciplinary organization advocating for global responsibility, whose mission is to clarify the public conversation, support the quest for solutions, and focus attention on the most important challenges facing the world today: technological disruption, ecological collapse, and the nuclear threat. 2002, PhD, University of Oxford lecturer, Department of History. 2002, PhD, University of Oxford lecturer, Department of History, Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Books have sold more than 20 million copies worldwide. Research focuses on macro-historical questions such as what is the relationship between history and biology? What is the essential difference between Homo sapiens and other animals? And is there justice in history? There can be no doubt of Harari's intelligence, but what of his judgment? Is he wise in how he approaches things? Karl Marx was certainly of high intelligence, as his critique of 19th century capitalism can still strike us as containing great truth, and yet communism has been responsible for untold suffering around the world. Like Marx, Harari seeks to remake society, professing a unique reinterpretation of history which better suits his aims. It has been said that if you control the past, you can control the future. The first task before Harari is to convince you that your understanding of the past is flawed, and once he convinces you of that, it will be so much easier to move you to his desired future. When Schwab and his fellow globalists like to speak to people, they don't start with their plans. They like to lull you into a sense of wonder by telling you a lot of things you might not know, and giving credit where credit is due. Harari is a first-class collector of esoteric, interesting information. However, it's his interpretation that is problematic, and I suspect even his fellow historians are probably aghast at his penchant for sweeping generalizations. In Harari's view, it would seem the greatest tool at hand for the globalists is the story, the narrative, or mythology that supports a society. In his book Sapiens, he confronts the question of how people collaborated to build the pyramids of Egypt. He writes of the problems that develop when technology allows for a population to move beyond the hunter-gatherer stage and live in villages or cities. The mere fact that one can feed 1,000 people in the same town or 2 million people in the same kingdom does not guarantee that they can agree how to divide the land and water, how to settle disputes and conflicts, and how to act in times of drought or war. And if no agreement can be reached, strife spreads, even if the storehouses are bulging. It was not food shortages that caused most of history's wars and revolutions. The French Revolution was spearheaded by affluent lawyers, not by famished peasants. The Roman Republic reached the height of its power by the 1st century BC, when treasure fleets from throughout the Mediterranean enriched the Roman beyond their ancestors' wildest dreams. Yet, it was at that moment of maximum affluence that the Roman political order collapsed into a series of deadly civil wars. For the typical reader, myself included, I might find that to be a fascinating, thoughtful paragraph. Harari raises an interesting possibility, namely, that revolutions often start in times of relative prosperity. This idea deserves further exploration. But rather than exploring the possibilities, Harari wants to give you his answer and make you believe it. Indeed, it doesn't appear as if he's an academic interested in exploring possibilities, but a propagandist for a certain point of view, wanting to convince you to join his merry band. The problem at the root of such calamities is that humans evolved for millions of years in small bands of a few dozen individuals. The handful of millennia separating the agricultural revolution from the appearance of cities, kingdoms, and empires was not enough time to allow an instinct for mass cooperation to evolve. Despite the fact of such biological instincts, during the foraging era, hundreds of people were able to cooperate thanks to their shared myths. However, this cooperation was loose and limited. In my opinion, this is where Harari starts to go off the rails. Or if you want to take a less charitable view, this is when he reveals how he wants to brainwash you. Does Harari genuinely believe that the French Revolution and the fall of the Roman Empire were due to a failure of mass cooperation, and that if these cultures only had a shared myth that they would have survived their challenges? That seems like an enormous leap of logic, and one that most traditional historians would vigorously challenge. In this vein, it's interesting to read Harari's critical acclaim and see how few of his endorsements come from academic historians. Indeed, it seems to come mostly from the ranks of the elite who might find themselves at a meeting of the World Economic Forum at Davos, Switzerland. Harari opens the door to asking the question of how people cooperated when they were members of a hunter-gatherer community. He asserts this is because they had shared myths. Did he not consider the possibility that if they did not cooperate, they were likely to perish? The typical hunter-gatherer community often lived on the razor edge of survival. In this context, I find myself agreeing with Harari that in these communities, decision-making was likely to be loose and limited. Let's simply assume that to be true. I return to the parable that started this book, the parable of Thag and Uther, the leader and the thinker. Let's imagine our small band living in a temporary village during that last ice age, when word spread through the village that a saber-toothed tiger has been prowling around the outskirts. The reports say the cat seems to be thin and undernourished. Thag immediately wants to spring into action, saying, "It must be an old cat who can't hunt for regular food, and that's why he's coming close to the village. Let's get a few men together and kill it." But Uther has a different idea. "It might be a mother with young cubs nearby. Maybe she looks thin because she's been feeding her cubs. If it's a mother, we'll need more than just a few warriors. Let's get a group together to observe, then we can decide what we need to do." Again, a dialogue between the leaders and thinkers of the tribe comes up with a better, safer plan. It could be argued that the philosophy with which the United States was founded respects the wisdom of the loose and limited cooperation of a typical hunter-gatherer tribe. The best formulation I've heard of the concept of the United States is that we have majority rule but minority rights. There are certain tasks in which it is essential to take action, such as building roads, taxes, providing education for the young, or having a military, although we have decided a volunteer military is preferable to a draft. But in most things, we let people make their own decisions. Harari accepts the idea that it was loose and limited cooperation that enabled the success of the hunter-gatherer tribes, allowing them to settle in villages, then cities, and establish nations. The missing component in Harari's analysis is he does not seem to consider the possibility that it was the rise of people like himself who think they know better than others that has caused so much strife as groups of people began to live in larger and larger communities. Harari argues that as groups of people became larger, the only thing holding them together was some sort of shared myth. Let's be honest about what Harari means when he says the word myth. In Harari's estimation, myths is just another word for lies, and yet he believes them to be socially useful fabrications. I believe it's in understanding exactly how Harari is defining words that it's made clear what a tyrannical dystopian world he wants to create. This is how he dismisses the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence proclaimed universal and eternal principles of justice, which, like those of Hammurabi, were inspired by a divine power. However, the most important principle dictated by the American God was somewhat different from the principle dictated by the gods of Babylon. The American Declaration of Independence asserts that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Harari's language puts me in anticipation that he's going to make the argument that the principles of the American Revolution bear little difference from the gods of Babylon, which is exactly what he ends up doing, as we shall see. Harari then commits his most egregious crime against humanity, stripping you of any rights you might have ever believed you possessed. According to science of biology, people were not created, they have evolved, and they certainly did not evolve to be equal. The idea of equality is inextricably intertwined with the idea of creation. The Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, which argues that every person has a divinely created soul, and that all souls are created before God. However, if we do not believe in the Christian myths about God, creation, and souls, what does it mean that all souls are equal? Evolution is based on difference, not on equality. It's in a paragraph such as this that we can see the true danger of Harari and his fellow globalists. Harari appears to believe that the idea of equality sprang from some mystical religious vision of Christianity rather than the great thinkers of their time observing the human condition and trying to figure out how to get people to live together as peacefully as possible. I don't have any argument with the idea that in Western civilization much of the advocacy for equality sprang from the Judeo-Christian tradition, but Harari does not seem to understand that the concept of every soul being equal before God would find wide acceptance in other religions such as Hinduism, and that the progress of a free soul, such as in Buddhism, is an essential right of every human being. Harari continues his unrelenting assault on human rights. Similarly, there are no such rights in biology. There are no organs, abilities, and characteristics. Birds fly not because they have a right to fly, but because they have wings. It's not true that these organs, abilities, and characteristics are unalienable. Many of them undergo constant mutations and may be completely lost over time. The ostrich is a bird that lost its ability to fly, so unalienable rights should be translated into mutable characteristics. What a fucking cocksucker. Sorry for my language. I don't believe it's too much of a stretch to say this is a paragraph that dangerously flirts with saying that humanity has no essential nature. Harari goes on to attack the ideas of liberty and happiness, for which he can find no specific way to measure, therefore concluding it doesn't exist, before offering up his own amended Declaration of Independence from his view of reality. So here is the line from the American Declaration of Independence translated into biological terms. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men evolve differently, that they are born with certain mutable characteristics, that among these are life and the pursuit of pleasure. In this single passage, Harari tells you the globalist plan. Evolution may have been the original creator rather than God, but the engineers, scientists, and managers of the New World Order will now engage in the work of recreating man into their own desired image. And they really don't have any plan for your liberty in this new world. Harari claims that any order we observe in a society does not reflect reality or an accepted way of running a society, but is only an example of imagined order. In their view, man has no natural state. Of course, there will be the elite who understand this, but in order for society to function, it's necessary to have a large number of fools, true believers, who believe the nonsense spouted by the leaders. Harari explains it in the following manner. A single priest often does the work of 100 soldiers far more cheaply and effectively. Moreover, no matter how efficient bayonets are, somebody must wield them. Why should the soldiers, jailers, judges, and police maintain an imagined order in which they do not believe? Of all human collective activities, the one most difficult to organize is violence. To say that a social order is maintained by a military force immediately raises the question, what maintains the military order? It is impossible to organize an army solely by coercion. At least some of the commanders and soldiers must truly believe in something, be it God, honor, motherland, manhood, or money. Without realizing it, Harari is arguing that man does have a natural state, and in that natural state, humans do not wish to commit violence against others. They need to be organized into an army, dedicated to some principle in order to commit this violence. So if all social order is only imagined, how could you get people to accept your new and improved order? You have to be constantly organizing the people and continually educating them. Becoming a global dictator, enforcing your will on the planet's population requires a lot of work. You need to get up early and work late. They don't mention that enough in Evil Dictator School, Harari explains. You also educate people constantly. From the moment they are born, you constantly remind them of the principles of the imagined world, which are incorporated into anything and everything. They are incorporated into fairy tales, dramas, paintings, songs, etiquette, political propaganda, architecture, recipes, and fashion. For example, today people believe in equality, so it's fashionable for rich kids to wear jeans, which were originally working class attire. Oh, how is how is Harari striking you now? Are you comfortable with the fact that it appears he's softening you up for an attack on equality? In addition, he wants you to know he's ready to go to war against all the things that you believe, in place of culture, which Harari seems to hold up as suspect because it upholds the imagined order of society rather than the accumulated wisdom of centuries. Harari wants to celebrate bureaucracy in a section he titles, without even a hint of irony, "The Wonders of Bureaucracy." In order to function, the people who operate such a system of drawers must be reprogrammed to stop thinking as humans and start thinking as clerks and accountants. As everyone from ancient times until today knows, clerks and accountants think in a non-human fashion. They think like filing cabinets. This is not their fault. If they don't think that way, their drawers would be all mixed up and they won't be able to provide the services their government, company, or organization requires. The most important impact of script on humanity the most important impact of script on human history is precisely this. It has gradually changed the way humans think and view the world. Free association and holistic thought have given way to compartmentalization and bureaucracy. Are there any accountants out there who might take exception to Harari's claims? The accountants I've known generally seem to be the best judges of human nature because they understand nothing reveals more about a person than where they spend their money. Rather than being disconnected from humanity, accountants are vitally connected to other human beings, and I'd hazard to guess that most people who work in a bureaucracy are painfully aware of the evidence put forward by generations of historians that the honor of Hitler's Germany could never have taken place without the blind eye of most of the German bureaucratic state. If you become an accountant or a bureaucrat, it does not mean you lose your humanity and turn into something else. I would also argue that compartmentalization was an enormous part of how the German nation was led into barbarism, as bureaucrats could go home and sleep at night thinking, I'm not persecuting Jews, I'm just making sure they get on the trains to go to their camps. In the chapter titled The Arrow of History, Harari starts to envision how one might create this all-encompassing world order. Merchants, conquerors, and prophets were the first people who managed to transcend the binary evolutionary division, us versus them, and to foresee the potential unity of humankind. For the merchants, the entire world was a single market, and all humans were potential customers. They tried to establish an economic order that would apply to all, everywhere. For the conquerors, the entire world was a single empire, and all humans were potential subjects. And for the prophets, the entire world held a single truth, and all humans were potential believers. One might also imagine Harari working in his academic ivory tower, pondering, what did history's most dangerous megalomaniacs do right, and how can my friends avoid their mistakes? In the chapter that follows, The Scent of Money, Harari seems to have found his answer. The tyrants of the past didn't just didn't bribe enough people. And when that didn't work, they needed to be more brutal. Harari sums up the problem in the concluding paragraph of his chapter. It is common nowadays to believe that the market always prevails, and that the dams erected by kings, priests, and communities cannot hold back the tides of money. This is naive. Brutal warriors, religious fanatics, and concerned citizens have repeatedly managed to trounce calculating merchants and even to reshape the economy. It is therefore impossible to understand the unification of humankind as a purely economic process. In order to understand how thousands of isolated cultures coalesced over time to form the global village of today, we must take into account the role of gold and silver, but we cannot disregard the equally crucial role of steel. The paragraph deeply troubles me. It seems to suggest that the suggest of any political system is based on the use of force rather than persuasion, and rather than the persuasion that typifies political discourse in a republic, Harari seems to prefer the force used by an empire. If you are a Star Wars fan, or even just a casual reader of history, you might be appalled to learn that Harari loves empires. He seeks to glorify them, despite how much brutality they may have caused to their people and others they deemed inferior. In a section titled, Evil Empires? He lays out his belief. The truth is that empire has been the world's most common form of political organization for the last 2,500 years. Most humans during these 2.5 millennia have lived in empires. Empire is also a very stable form of government. Most empires have found it alarmingly easy to put down rebellions. In general, they have been toppled only by external invasion or by a split within the ruling elite. Conversely, conquered people don't have a good record of freeing themselves from their imperial overlords. Most have remained subjugated for hundreds of years. Typically, they have slowly digested. Typically, they have been slowly digested by the conquering empire until their distinct cultures fizzled out. This is pretty much the standard left-wing critique of Western civilization, and yet Harari is saying that the obliteration of native cultures was a good thing. I stand second to none in the defense of Western values as developed during the Enlightenment, but I'm not so blind as to deny the horrible historical acts perpetrated by Europeans as they spread across the globe. I will argue that these acts were a direct betrayal of the principles of the Enlightenment and should be condemned by all people. True power comes from the persuasion of rational arguments, not the sword. Harari continues with his worship of empires. It is tempting to divide history into good guys and bad guys, with all empires being among the bad guys, for the vast majority of empires were founded on blood and maintained their power through oppression and war. Yet most of today's cultures are based on imperial legacies. If empires are by definition bad, what does that say about us? How can there be the slightest bit of doubt as to the methods Harari and his globalist friends will use to bring about their utopia? They are not horrified by oppression and war. They see oppression and war as useful tools, and they must be used ruthlessly. Harari continues his terror parade, hyping the threat of nuclear war and climate change, scaring you into thinking you need somebody to save you before letting you know he has the answers. Hint, they involve genetic engineering, turning you into a robot, and creating an AI god to rule over humanity. I wish I were kidding. Harari begins his argument. An even greater challenge is posed by new technologies such as bioengineering and artificial intelligence, and as we shall see in the last chapter, these technologies should be used to re-engineer not just our weapons and vehicles, but our bodies and minds. Indeed, they could be used to create completely new types of life forms and change the future course of evolution. We will decide what to do with such divine powers. Who would decide what to do with such divine powers of creation? Do these globalists now appear to you as the ultimate mad scientists? Not only will they enslave you, but they will gleefully re-engineer you, perhaps with machines or gene editing, to better suit their purposes. After denigrating the pursuit of happiness in the American Declaration of Independence, he justifies his draconian imperial measures in one of his concluding chapters titled, "And They Lived Happily Ever After." Harari notes the amazing progress of humanity over the past 500 years, which amazingly coincides with the development of the ideas of personal freedom as defined by the Enlightenment, and then questions whether his progress has made us happier. He writes, "What would happen if serious research were to disprove these hypotheses? If economic growth and self-reliance did not make people happier, then what's the benefit of capitalism? What if it turns out that the subjects of large empires are generally happier than the citizens of independent states, and that, for example, Ghanaians were happier under British colonial rule than under their own homegrown dictators? What would that say about the process of decolonization and the value of national self-determination?" It's in a passage like this in which we come to understand how willing Harari is to engage in duplicity. In an earlier section of the book, he claimed that happiness was such an elusive concept to define that the best we could hope to do was measure pleasure. Yet, now he's claiming this brave new world he wants to create will be a happier one, as our material advancement has not made us happier. Harari explains, "This raises the possibility that the immense improvement in material conditions over the last 2 centuries was offset by the collapse of the family and the community. If so, the average person might well be no happier today than in 1800. Even the freedom we value so highly may be working against us. We can choose our spouses, friends, and neighbors, but they can choose to leave us. With the individual wielding unprecedented power to decide her own path in life, we find it even harder to make commitments. We thus live in an increasingly lonely world of unraveling communities and families." It's difficult to wrap one's mind around the idea that Harari and his fellow globalists are actively calling for your freedom to be restricted, just as in the terrifying dystopian future of A Handmaid's Tale. They claim that you can't be trusted with freedom. Freedom makes you weak and unhappy. But Harari then moves to how he's going to make you happier. No surprise that it's by convincing you that you want what he wants. Here's a simplistic explanation put forth by Harari. Get ready for the harness to be placed around your neck. "But the most important thing of all is that happiness does not really depend on objective conditions of either wealth, health, or even community. Rather, it depends on the correlation between objective conditions and subjective expectations. If you want a bullock cart and get a bullock cart, you are content. If you want a brand new Ferrari and get only a second-hand Fiat, you feel deprived. This is why winning the lottery has over time the same impact on people's happiness as a debilitating car accident. When things improve, expectations balloon, and consequently ever-dramatic improvements in objective conditions can leave us dissatisfied." Harari is quoting a famous 1978 study titled "Lottery Winners and Accident Victims. Is Happiness Relative?" That found that lottery winners were not as happy as expected, and that accident victims who'd been rendered paraplegic after a certain level of time had passed reported happiness levels that were higher than expected. This was explained by the idea of expectation and habituation, and Harari's analysis is well in the mainstream of traditional thought about these findings. However, others have noted that a different interpretation is possible, even likely. It's that our attitude, whether optimistic or pessimistic, eventually predominates regardless of the conditions in which we live. An entire cottage industry of books has sprung up in recent years, telling us that our attitude is the first thing we must fix in order to have the best chance of achieving our desired goals. Harari even seems to flirt with this idea. "Think for a moment of your family and friends. You know some people who will remain relatively joyful no matter what befalls them, and then there are those who are always disgruntled no matter what gifts the world lays at their feet. We tend to believe that if we could just change our workplace, get married, finish writing that novel, buy a new car, or repay the mortgage, we would be on top of the world. Yet, when we get what we desire, we don't seem to be any happier. Buying cars and writing novels don't change our biochemistry. They can startle it for a fleeting moment, but it is soon back to its set point. And so we come to Harari's answer to the question of human happiness. It's not your attitude or anything you might develop on your own. It's your biochemistry. Don't worry about eating healthy food, exercising, having positive social relationships, or developing a relationship with God. Harari is going to make it all better by giving you a happiness pill. It'll be like smoking pot when you were a teenager because that's how you dealt with things, or drinking alcohol at 10 in the morning. But somehow alcohol and other drugs never confronted the real problems of your life. Remember, it's always important to be a victim in Harari's world, not somebody who takes responsibility. Harari seems to take particular delight in the possibility of a drugged-out world, as he expresses his enthusiasm for the future depicted by Aldous Huxley in his 1932 science fiction novel, Brave New World. In Aldous Huxley's dystopian novel Brave New World, published in 1932, at the height of the Great Depression, happiness is the supreme value, and psychiatric drugs replace the police and the ballot as the foundation of politics. Every day, each person takes a dose of Soma, a synthetic drug which makes people happy without harming their productivity and efficiency. The world state that governs the entire globe is never threatened by wars, revolutions, strikes, or demonstrations, because all people are supremely content with their current conditions, whatever that may be. Huxley's vision is far more troubling than George Orwell's 1984. Huxley's world seems monstrous to most readers, but it's hard to explain why. Everybody is happy all the time. What could be wrong with that? Actually, it's not hard to explain why Huxley's world seems monstrous to most readers. It's because it is monstrous. Most people don't want to live their life in a drugged-out haze. They want to be alive, not impaired. They want to feel the highs and lows of life. That's what gives life meaning. Harari reminds me of nothing more than some religion-obsessed monk of the Middle Ages who, while seeking the enlightenment of the spiritual world, will engage in the greatest acts of brutality in the physical world. He would beat a person for an impure thought, while not realizing the damage he's doing to God's creation. He is the villain who believes himself to be the hero, and he initiates the Inquisition. Harari tires not just of humanity, but indeed, he is done with the natural world itself. Today, the 4-billion-year-old regime of natural selection is facing a completely different challenge. In laboratories around the world, scientists are engineering living beings. They break the laws of natural selection with impunity, unbridled by even an organism's original characteristics. Eduardo Kac, a Brazilian bio-artist, decided in 2000 to create a new work of art, a fluorescent green rabbit. Kac contacted a French laboratory and offered it a fee to engineer. Kac contacted a French laboratory and offered it a fee to engineer a radiant bunny according to his specifications. The French scientists took a run-of-the-mill rabbit embryo, implanted in its DNA a gene taken from a green fluorescent jellyfish, and voila! One green fluorescent rabbit for le monsieur. Kak named the rabbit Alba. I'm so happy we got these good scientists, man. Harari is thrilled beyond belief at this turn of events, greeting it with the reverence of a UFO enthusiast might react to a flying saucer landing on the south lawn of the White House. For these globalists, every scientific advance heralded the dawn of an exciting new era in which they will finally be triumphant. After 4 billion years of natural selection, Alba stands at the dawn of a new cosmic era in which life will be ruled by intelligent design. If this happens, the whole of human history up to that point might, with hindsight, be reinterpreted as a process of experimentation and apprenticeship that revolutionized the game of life. Such a process should be understood from a cosmic perspective of billions of years rather than from a human perspective of millennia. It's difficult to get giddier than Harari does in that passage. I'm just a little surprised how anyone can claim Harari is an academic historian when he uses phrases like new cosmic era with a straight face. Isn't his work a little more appropriate for some new age self-help book than a university campus? However, Harari isn't going to be satisfied with you feeling better about yourself, of having a clean aura like your typical new age zealot. You get to be biologically re-engineered. Harari explains, at the time of writing, the replacement of natural selection by intelligent design could happen in any of the 3 ways. Through biological engineering, cyborg engineering. Cyborgs are beings that combine organic with non-organic parts, or the engineering of inorganic life. If by chance you find yourself a little concerned by this radical new idea of biological engineering, Harari is quick to remind you that you don't need to worry. In fact, you didn't even have to fear the old type of biological engineering. There is nothing new about biological engineering per se. People have been using it for millennia in order to reshape themselves in other organisms. A simple example is castration. Humans have been castrating bulls for perhaps 10,000 years in order to create oxen. Oxen are less aggressive and are thus easier to train to pull plows. Singers with enchanting voices and eunuchs who could safely be entrusted with overseeing the Sultan's harem. Many are worried about losing their First and Second Amendment rights in this New World Order being promoted by Klaus Schwab and his globalists, but perhaps the men of the Old World Order should be equally fearful of losing their balls if Schwab and his minions develop an ear for enchanting voices or decided that harems are a pretty good idea. And how far might this biological engineering go? After talking about how pigs can be genetically altered to turn bad omega-6 fatty acid into the healthier omega-3 fatty acid, Harari lets you know the full extent of his plan. The next generation of genetic engineering will make pigs with good fat look like child's play. Geneticists have managed not merely to extend the average life expectancy of worms, but also to engineer genius mice that display much improved memory and learning skills. Voles are small, stout rodents resembling mice, and most varieties of moles are promiscuous. But there is one species in which boy and girl voles form long-lasting monogamous relationships. Geneticists claim to have isolated the genes responsible for vole monogamy. In the addition of a gene can turn a vole Don Juan into a loyal and loving husband. Are we far off from being able to genetically engineer not only the individual abilities of rodents and humans, but also their social structure? Let's imagine the future that Harari imagines comes to pass, and we develop remarkable technology to cure disease or increase our abilities. Maybe people will eventually be able to do marathons in their 90s in addition to doing work that fulfills them, as they offer an unprecedented wisdom to the young. Do you imagine you will be in control of such decisions? Or will you be under the thumb of globalists, those people who think empires and a drugged-out populace are such a good idea? But perhaps, like the globalists, you are somewhat disgusted by the physical world. You lust after sleekness of machines. You may want to become a cyborg like Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Terminator movies, or the Borg of Star Trek, or the dead policeman brought back to life and fitted with the latest technology to become RoboCop. In the series of movies that depict a dystopian future where police work is outsourced to an evil corporation that oppresses the citizens, Harari is happy to upgrade you. There is another new technology which could change the laws of life. Cyborg engineering. Cyborgs are beings that combine organic and inorganic parts, such as a human with bionic hands. In a sense, nearly all of us are bionic these days, since our natural senses and functions are supplemented by devices such as eyeglasses, pacemakers, orthotics, and even computers and mobile phones, which relieve our brains of some of their data storage and processing burdens. We stand poised on the brink of becoming true cyborgs, of having inorganic features that are inseparable from our bodies, features that modify our abilities, desires, personalities, and identities. The enormous leaps of logic made by Harari are breathtaking. I'm sure you didn't realize those reading glasses made you a cyborg. Apparently, there's not much difference between the typical drugstore reading glasses you pick up for $10 and having a chip implanted in your head. Of course, it starts with bugs, but we know it won't end there. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, a U.S. military research agency, is developing cyborgs out of insects. The idea is to implant electronic chips, detectors, and processors in the bodies of a fly or cockroach, which will enable either a human or an automatic operator to control the insect's movements remotely and to absorb and transmit information. Such a fly could be sitting on the wall at enemy headquarters, eavesdrop on the most secret conversations, and, if it isn't caught first by a spider, could inform us exactly what the enemy was planning. When you read Harari, you sometimes feel like you're the fictional British spy Austin Powers, listening to the plans of Dr. Evil, but instead of sharks with frickin' lasers on their heads, you get remote control flies with chips in their bodies. And have no fear, the cyborgs will eventually be turned on those who do not submit. You will be assimilated. But Harari seems most thrilled by the possibility of non-biological life as the solution of those troublesome human beings who can be so difficult to organize into an army that can then be ordered to bayonet people the government doesn't like. But even then, the army might not follow your orders unless you convince them the people they're going to bayonet are really bad people. Like those who might claim the votes need to be recounted in an election. We all know that asking for validation of a vote is the same thing as inciting an insurrection. Harari explains how we might get rid of human beings entirely. The third way to change the laws of life is to engineer completely inorganic beings. The most obvious examples are computer programs that can undergo independent evolution. Recent advances in machine learning already enable present-day computer programs to evolve by themselves. Though the program is initially coded by human engineers, it can subsequently acquire new information on its own, teach itself new skills, and gain insights that go beyond those of its human creators. The computer program is therefore free to evolve in directions its makers could never have envisioned. Harari sounds like such a proud parent, doesn't he? It's like he gave birth to a computer program, and if the machine starts to misbehave, well, unlike a human being, you can't just turn it off. What if your laptop could also be your brain? Imagine another possibility. Suppose you could back up your brain to a portable hard drive and then run it on your laptop. Would your laptop be able to think and feel just like a sapiens? If so, would it be you or someone else? What if computer programmers could create an entirely new but digital mind composed of computer code, complete with a sense of self, consciousness, and memory? If you ran the program on your computer, would it be a person? If you deleted it, could you be charged with murder? If you believe Harari is going to simply stop with intelligent machines, you are sorely mistaken. He believes these intelligent machines will eventually take over, an event he and many others call the singularity. In case you were having a little trouble working up the intellectual energy to consider his plans for the suicide of the human race, he helpfully highlights his genocidal plans in a section titled The Singularity. From that section, most science fiction plots describe a world in which sapiens identical to us enjoy superior technology such as light-speed spaceships and laser guns. The ethical and political dilemmas central to these plots are taken from our own world, and they merely recreate our emotional and social tensions against a futuristic backdrop. Yet, real potential of future technologies is to change Homo sapiens itself, including our emotions and desires, and not merely our vehicles and weapons. What is a spaceship compared to an eternally young cyborg who does not breed and has no sexuality, who can share thoughts directly with other beings, whose abilities to focus and remember are 1,000 times greater than our own, and who is never angry or sad, but has emotions and desires that we cannot begin to imagine? Do you think this is a future that could ever win wide acceptance among the general public? Harari hopes you do not breed, never have sex, and instead share thoughts directly with other beings, and that you will never be angry or sad, and have emotions and desires that we cannot begin to imagine. Does this sound like any human future of which you want to be a part? Again, Harari reminds me of a crazed religious zealot, so disgusted by the flesh that he only wants to exist in the spiritual world. But because Harari recognizes no God or spiritual plane of existence, he tries to fill the God-shaped hole in his soul with technology. However, for those of us who do acknowledge a spiritual reality, this is an old and familiar tale. It is the common story of one who does not acknowledge the Creator, and in doing so, seeks to supplant him. In the religious traditions of the world, those who walk this path risk becoming demons and devils, the most hideous creatures in all creation. In the afterword, the animal who became a god, he proudly declares his heresy. 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens was still an insignificant animal minding its own business in a corner of Africa. In the following millennia, it transformed itself into the master of the entire planet and the terror of the ecosystem. Today, it stands on the verge of becoming a god, poised to acquire not only eternal youth, but also the divine abilities of creation and destruction. We know the type of future Harari envisions for human beings: genetic manipulation, robotic enhancements, and non-organic life that eventually rules over us. But who steals the ruler? But we know who the real rulers will be. The globalists with Klaus Schwab or his downloaded brain giving us all orders from his laptop. In his next book, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, Harari provides more details on his preferred future. Part 1 is titled Homo Sapiens Conquers the World, and Part 2 is Homo Sapiens Gives Meaning to the World. Essentially, a recap of many of the points he made in Sapiens. Part 3, Homo Sapiens Loses Control, is where Harari really gets going with his futuristic plans in a chapter titled The Time Bomb in the Laboratory. Now you might be forgiven if you thought the chapter was about China and the United States experimenting with dangerous bat viruses and how one escaped, causing a worldwide pandemic and killing millions, but you'd be mistaken. Instead, this is what Harari had to say. In 2016, the world is dominated by the liberal package of individualism, human rights, democracy, and the free market. Yet 21st century science is undermining the foundations of the liberal order, because science does not deal with questions of value. It cannot determine whether liberals are right in valuing liberty more than equality or in valuing the individual more than the collective. However, like every other religion, liberalism too is based not only on abstract ethical judgments, but also on what is believed to be factual statements, and these factual statements just don't stand up to rigorous scientific scrutiny. In Harari's vision, if you like individualism, human rights, democracy, and the free market, you're just a deluded fool. It's all part of some imagined order rather than a system developed by brilliant, compassionate people over the centuries as the most effective way for us to live together in a manner that is conducive to the greatest good for the largest number of people. If you don't believe Harari is interested in tearing down all these pillars of a civil society, I offer this passage. To the best of our scientific understanding, determinism and randomness have divided the entire cake between them, leaving not a crumb for freedom. The sacred word freedom turns out to be just like soul, a hollow term empty of any discernible meaning. Free will exists only in the imaginary stories we humans have invented. It staggers the mind that the person who wrote those words is not universally condemned by all the supposed lovers of freedom. One almost imagined they're reading the words of a young Adolf Hitler or Joseph Stalin rather than the writings of an Israeli academic. If there's no such thing as free will, how could anybody ever be prosecuted for rape, murder, or any crime? This is a version of hell where nothing is forbidden and all things are permitted. After attacking liberalism all through the chapter, even equating medieval crusaders and today's liberals as similarly delusional, Harari lays it out. However, once the heretical scientific insights are translated into everyday technology, routine activities, and economic structures, it will become increasingly difficult to sustain this double game, believing in science and free will, and we